this might be too long. Okay, you're ready to go. So,
Thank you.
That's over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you everybody for coming. Alongside the growing literature on the sociology of food, I'm a sociologist, and so I'm very nervous about being here amongst historians because I'm an interloper trespassing on your territory. So when I go wrong, I'm trusting you to tell me that historians don't do it like that and how I should do it. So, as I say, alongside the growing literature in the sociology of food, the history of food is longer established, adding to a field in which the humanities and social sciences are contributing and collaborating at an increasing pace. A notable feature of this growth is that the range of topics tackled is wide: food and memory, eating out, food insecurity, meal patterns, implications of brands in the 19th century, the expansion of cookery books, and so much more. In particular, a recurrent theme is the movement of foodstuffs, people and their cuisines, coupled with massive volumes of imports and exports in ever-lengthening food chains around the globe. In shorthand, the globalisation of the food system. Without food packaging, the tin cans and the barrels, the cardboard boxes and the glass bottles and jars, and perhaps above all nowadays, the plastic trays, bottles and films, the global food supply would look completely different. There'd be no more strawberries on sale on December the 24th in Northern Europe, no more raw green beans ready to slice and steam in the kitchen at home all the year round in New York City. The English asparagus season would return to its few short weeks in late May. Pawpaws, dragon fruit, lychees and avocado pears would revert to being exotic imports found only in the most cosmopolitan neighbourhoods of metropolises at premium prices. What is conspicuous by its absence in so much of the literature on the globalisation of the food system is any curiosity about what the foods are moved around the world in. It is surprising to discover, for instance, that large quantities of liquid eggs are imported from China to London in the 1890s, adulterated with boracic acid to preserve them for longer. Were the containers in which they came like wooden milk churns used? Were containers like wooden milk churns used, or perhaps barrels? And despite the boracic acid, how long did the eggs remain safe to eat? And what were the circumstances in which they were shelled and packed? As much to the point, how did the trade ever arise in the first place, and when did it do so? Were there and did there continue to be obstacles in the whole process, start to finish from hens to London, associated with the nature of liquid egg, the rate it goes off, any taint it picks up from a material of which the container is fabricated? Is the appearance altered by some rather than other types of packing? Does the taste change over time? What were the decisions about containers and packaging? Who made them? Did these decisions change? Was the packaging updated? Why and how? These and more are the questions that the brief note of importing liquid eggs from China to London over a century ago prompted. Tantalisingly, it's in an article by Derek Oddie, in 2007. Tantalisingly, the mention is not even referenced. I have no idea what the source of this is. Now, just a single source has been located thus far, which is also curious about the same sorts of questions. This isn't a book not by an academic, but by someone called Sarah Murray, described at the time of the book's publication as a contributor to the Financial Times. Oh, I'm not sitting in front of it. I can't find the... Thank you. I can't find the...
Could you speak up a bit?
Yes, of course. So sorry. I'll hold this up. That might be better. You may not be able to see me, but you might be able to hear. Would you prefer me to stand up?
No, you sit to the original. Just if you could speak up a bit.
Yes, sure. And please interrupt again if my voice drops, because it's not fair of me otherwise. Her book, whose cover is there, and I've got a lot of book covers just because a lot of them are nicely designed and you might want something new to look at. Her book, called Movable Feasts, selects vivid and ancient examples of the global movement of foodstuffs as nothing new. Long before, she says, Vasco da Gama's arrival in India, food was being hauled over great distances. The ancient Silk Road, the trading conduit for, among other goods, tea and spices, was at least 7,000 miles long. The Romans moved food all over their empire. British archaeologists, she goes on, recently discovered a 2,000-year-old food jar with a label showing it once contained fish paste, thought to have been shipped to Carlisle from Cadiz in Spain, more than 1,400 miles away. Some, she goes on, might be curious as to how Roman officers in a far-flung corner of their empire acquired a taste for fish paste, or when and how they ate it. She, by contrast, is less so, asking instead, how exactly did the paste get to such a remote corner of the Roman world? What sorts of containers did it travel in, and how? In the absence of refrigeration and vacuum-sealed packs, did the fishy concoction go bad during its journey? What follows today will form part of the opening chapter of a book on the history of food packaging. It has the hackneyed title, The Secret Life of Food Packaging, much loved by my editor, although it may well have to be amended to The Not-So-Secret Life of Food Packaging, because discussion of packaging has become so prominent since this work was originally planned that its life is nothing like as secret as it was. There is good reason for starting off thinking of packaging in terms of secrecy, in that for decades food packaging was so taken for granted that it was only noticed when causing a problem, doing so intermittently. It's when it caused accidents, people cutting themselves when they're opening a can, or litter blowing around. But now, of course, it is widely considered to be causing a problem, primarily in respect of single-use plastic, and doing so is no longer intermittent. Well before discovering Murray's book, the present project was designed to revolve around the central question about the 21st century food systems packaging: how did it get this way? In today's talk, that question recurs later. The talk begins by attempting to develop and indeed refine the case that the history of food packaging has been neglected, and second, to note that its continuing history and development is also the history of many other related phenomena. And this is a slide I've put together which shows all kinds of things that if you're doing a history of food packaging, I argue you need to consider. So there's a history of containers, there's pallets, Greek amphorae. She's selling strawberries out of a specially designed little straw basket called a pottle with a P, not bottle with a B. The invention of recycling, the cod beer bottle, there's 5 of them there. That machine there is a plastic bag making machine, I think I'm right in saying, and that there of course is a forklift truck. You couldn't actually manage modern food supply without forklift trucks and pallets. So that's just a hint of some of the collection of other things that the history has to attend to, and I shall speed through that if I have time as the second section of the talk. And the third section is very tentatively to ponder on the sort of considerations to be taken into account in pursuing a history of food packaging. In other words, what could or should such a history look like? It must be noted incidentally, that reference is made only to English language sources, and that despite efforts at minimising Eurocentrism, the materials primarily referred to are parochially British, not, it must be stressed, out of choice, but a necessity given the kind of book this is. In other words, one designed to open out a field and intended to be superseded, and for a variety of reasons needing to be finished sooner rather than later. So let me start on the first longest section of the talk, which is the case for claiming that the history of food packaging is neglected. At first sight, it's tempting to say that there's a gaping hole where the history and sociology of food packaging should be. As yet, no book-length treatment on its history has been located. Certainly, there is the historian and art and design critic Thomas Hine, an American, who published a book in 1995 on packaging in general, and it's about maybe half, even 2/3 of the discussion is devoted to food packaging, given such a high proportion of the total amount and type of packaging that is devoted to packaging food. And there are some honourable and important exceptions, largely journal articles and chapters, which I may mention later and are discussed in more detail in the book. And this is not to say that nothing is written about food packaging. The reverse is the case, for there is a sizable technical literature for the industry and those in training to work in the industry in the form of textbooks, handbooks and several academic journals. And while these do at times mention historical aspects of food packaging, they are neither primarily dedicated to it nor written by professional historians. We'll come to that, sociologists. In addition, there's a trade press, for instance, Packaging News, which also has a website, and a plethora of online newsletters. There's a series called Food Dive, Retail Dive, and Recycling Dive, all of which cover packaging, which come from the United States. In addition, professional historians are now and then commissioned to write company histories, for instance, that of Metal Box, written by W.J. Reader, and the history of Marks and Spencer's, which Goronwy Rees wrote, both of which actually have are valuable sources for thinking about food packaging, either tin cans or canisters rather, and of course Marks and Spencer's. Furthermore, an apparent absence of work on the history of food packaging written by trained historians is not for want of material. On the contrary, the more work on this book proceeded, the more additional primary sources were uncovered. Companies' own websites, the introductions to textbooks, even little vignettes on packaging itself, never mind company archives whose contents appear to be seriously underexplored, at least as far as documenting the history of packaging goes, which would of course supplement those company histories. One primary source, a court to proceedings. Oh, I think actually, no, it isn't. I've got another slide on a little history in an unexpected place a little later on. I thought it was here, but it's not. But one especially engaging example, and of course there are court proceedings which historians are used to using for all kind of purposes other than to count how many people broke the law or whatever. One especially engaging example is found in the proceedings of the Old Bailey, which are now, as I'm sure you know better than I, are online. So in December 1747, 2 men were tried for involvement in running what were called uncustomed goods, which they brought ashore at Lydd on the Romney Marshes and the Kent coast. A witness called John Bolton reported seeing, and I'm quoting from the proceedings, the goods, and these are his words, the goods brought from, he's reported seeing the goods brought from on board the cutter. The goods that are generally run for the ease of carriage and stowage are tea, brandy or wine in small casks. The tea, when it comes from Flushing, Boulogne or any of the opposite coasts, they put on board the cutter all in oilskin bags. And these bags are tied together so that when they come ashore, then they have nothing to do but throw them across the horses. Now, what gives the smugglers away then is the packaging, the size of the wooden casks of brandy and the materials of which the bags of tea are made. And John Bolton clarifies the significance of this for the court. He says, no fair merchant ever imports tea in oilskin bags. 'Tis well known by all the people in the country, when they see oilskin bags, whose they are. Neither can any brandy or wine be imported in any cask less than 60 gallons, but they always import it in casks they call half anchors, and they fling them the same way. As this witness explains a little later, there is a canvas within side of the oilskin, and the tea is within that, and generally put up in 250 bags. So it's only those up to no good who would need to protect tea from the elements, or to organising transporting wine in small barrels, except those interested in the speediest of handling in unorthodox conditions to evade detection. In the process, the court record provides confirmation for the period of commonplace examples of food packaging, the types of material used for bags, the informal practicalities of attempting to evade the law, and an additional glimpse of the actual workings of regulation governing the size of barrel of taxable imports. As this book's existence testifies, there seem to be enough sources for the history of food packaging to be written, and of course through the book I draw on a huge range of sources. At the same time, substantiating an absence, i.e. the existence of a gap in the literature, verges on the perverse, and in any case requires being a little more precise. For it is not that historians have wholly ignored food packaging. 3 instances will suffice to illustrate the point. One deals with late medieval England, one with cuisines worldwide, and a third with broadly 17th to early 20th century England, and of course there are others. And the first comes from Woolgar's The Culture of Food in England, sort of late medieval, which covers a host of topics: ingredients, butchering, the look of a cheese, the making of flans in the monastery, and the silver salvers on which the ladies of a great household would give food alms to the poor. In the process, he pays attention, of course, to spices as things of great value. Now, the fact that spices can readily transfer their flavour or smell ensured, as Woolgar says, that they were to be kept separately. This leads him to attend to their packaging. Spices customers, for example, often paid, he says, for packets or for paper at the same time as they bought spices, and some, at least, was required to wrap the spices. And he goes on to add that they might buy other containers, such as the basket, 2 ells of canvas, and a little sack bought by the master of the cellar at Norwich Cathedral Priory in 1291 or 2. The material character of the foodstuffs, then, is also at issue when Woolgar notes that some spices, along with dried fruit, may have been shipped from the Mediterranean ready packaged. Frails, which is a basket of figs, or bales of dates on the branch, or larger quantities of other spices. And he adds that pots and boxes would have been used to import green ginger or citronade, which is made of sugar and citrons, a precursor to a lemon. Possibly, he adds, like modern Turkish delight is packed. I suspect he means those split slivers of bent wood. I think they might even call chip boxes, but I have to check this still. An inventory, he goes on, of a Bishop of Winchester's goods, found on his death in 1319, reveals that a major consignment of spices would have been transported: sugar and spices in barrels, almonds by the bale, a 36-pound bundle of saffron. That's a heck of a lot of saffron. So textiles, wood and canes, etc. for baskets, all figured in the food packages of the late Middle Ages. A second historian who mentions food packaging is Rachel. I never know whether she's called Loudon or Lawden. She's a really nice historian, American, as you probably know, in her book Cuisine and Empire. And she has a centuries-long sweeping history of cuisines worldwide. And she organises a discussion in terms of some half-dozen families of cuisine, as she calls them, which tend to become attached to empires, in other words, states, which achieved most permanence by virtue of having the greatest geographic reach. Coining the neat expression global culinary geography, she pauses now and then to focus on it for different eras, around 1650, jumping to mid-19th century, after World War I till the end of the 20th century, and finally for 2000. She talks of the 17th century movement of sugar, of the routes that opened up across the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans to join the older established Silk Roads, and, as she puts it, the mastery of the manipulation of soybeans and wheat to make tofu and gluten. And she notes the way that, and I quote, sugar made bitter tea, coffee and drinking chocolate more palatable in the 19th century, and how the steam engines of the Industrial Revolution were used to manufacture biscuits, now baked on a conveyor belt running through the oven, continuous process baking, in other words. And she includes, and I couldn't unfortunately get it to reproduce, a lovely world map of curry and the expansion of Anglo cuisine, with looping dotted lines across oceans and so on. But virtually nowhere does she even ask, let alone discuss, what that enormous volume of foodstuffs moved round the world over centuries was packed in, if at all, as they were carried in ships' holds over those vast distances. Once or twice a swift mention surfaces. Many packaged foods, she says, were on offer from 20th century, some of which, like frozen concentrated orange juice, fish sticks, Kool-Aid and more, were accepted, while others, such as canned deep-fried hamburgers, were rejected. Canned goods had, she points out, taken over from the fresh fruits and vegetables that Francesco Cirio initially transported through the newly opened tunnels through the Alps in refrigerated railway carriages. By the 1870s, with the firm producing 1 million kilograms of canned asparagus, artichokes, peaches and peas annually. To observe that she really mentions packaging is not to condemn her book, but simply to recognising she is writing about something for which she deems packaging is tangential. It's there, but certainly not centrally so. And a third example that also covers packaging in passing is Dorothy Hartnett's classic Food in England. And her chapter on pies, puddings, pastries and cakes, for example, gives a recipe for Banbury cakes, which she records used to be carried around all hot and crisp and fresh in specially made chip baskets, wrapped in white linen cloths. And she provides a little line drawing of the basket, showing its flannel-lined lid. She's a bit inconsistent. Her text talks about linen and her drawing refers to flannel. And you probably know that she illustrates the book herself. All those little line drawings are her own. And she has this neat little diagram, you can see here. It looks a little bit like a sort of, those chocolate oranges at Christmas time, or segments of an orange. And if anybody who knows Banbury will know that that segment is exactly the shape of a Banbury cake. And so the basket was made specially designed to hold a series of Banbury cakes, packed orange fashion. Another instance is her chapter on bread, which necessarily includes reference to brewer's yeast. And she said brewer's yeast was one of the perquisites of the brewer's wife and sold to the farmer's wife at market, to which it was carried in earthenware jars covered with a cloth. For safety, these were placed overhead on the top shelves of the carrier's cart, above the benches on which the passengers sat. And she says that a contemporary sketch mentions the indignation of the market women when the jerking and shaking in the heat of the enclosed cars sets the yeast working, and despite the cloths, the jars froth over and drip down onto their best bonnets! ! She adds. Enchanting as these glimpses might be, Hartley seems to be much more interested in her subject matter than including dates or documenting her sources. And the packaging she does mention is once again in passing, an incidental tidbit for which she must have had some source, although she hardly ever tells her readers what it is. More rigorous is Dorothy Davis in her history of shopping, and unlike Hartley's, the index actually itemises packaging. Discussing English town markets, which were almost exclusively for the sale of food in the late Middle Ages, she points out that nothing was wrapped or packaged except for barrelled goods. It would seem that she relies on informed guesswork to add, we can picture a townswoman taking an apprentice or servant to the market with a linen cloth to wrap the meat in, a sack for corn from a cornmonger or farmer, or perhaps meal from the miller, and she might tuck a length of cloth under her arm. But the poultry would dangle by the legs, and the whole fish, candles, peppercorns, spices, sugarloaf and all would be at large in a basket. Ale, milk and fresh water would all have to be fetched to the house in her containers. And it is alleged that butterbur, this is the plant, got its name because its great thick leaves were once used to wrap small quantities of butter. Davis also deals with a more widely known practice right into the mid-20th century of retail grocers buying wholesale and then packaging smaller quantities of, say, butter or cheese to meet customers' requirements, with one 19th century guide recommending that wrapping paper may be conveniently kept ready cut to handy sizes to reduce customers' waiting time. And I can come back and say a little bit more about that if anybody's interested. One of the topics to be covered in this book is what I've called the afterlife, and I'm not the only one who calls it that, the afterlife of food packaging. Davis gives a nice 17th to 18th century example of its obverse. Booksellers of the period bound books for their customers on demand. So someone looking for a book would most likely look at some loose pages before deciding to buy, and only at that point deciding on their preferred type of binding, luxurious or plain, or perhaps matching other bindings in their library. It meant, however, that booksellers were on occasion left with a surplus, a common fate, says Davis, of all unsuccessful books throughout the 17th century, which was to be sold off to the grocers and apothecaries for use as wrapping paper, or alternatively to the cook shop to make pie cases. So Davis's book is noteworthy because whoever compiled the index not only included packaging as an entry, but was sufficiently taken with the record of using pages for books to identify the practice separately. John Stobbart's detailed study of 17th to 19th century grocers and groceries in the English provinces does not just include packaging in the index, but shows the centrality of packaging to his topic. By contrast with the previous authors I've discussed, who mentioned packaging in passing, Stobbart's coverage is, by comparison, substantial, in some ways rectifying the omission of asking in what foods were packed when moved around the world, especially as he says, from the inception, grocers in England were closely linked to the sale of imported goods. He draws extensively on grocers' inventories, generated either on death or when a grocery was sold. And these provide detail not just of the stock held, but of all kinds of essential accoutrements, such as 17th century shop furnishings, scales, chests, shelves, and a shopboard. Listed among them, for instance, are containers, boxes and chests, barrels and firkins, and a wide range of barrels, cans, measures, canisters for tea, barrels and casks. Oh, I've repeated barrel. And what I won't go into now, but there's a discussion in the early part of this first chapter of the book as to where food packaging stops and storage containers start, or even cooking utensils start, because there is, if you like, a continuum, and the food packaging industry has a definition which, historically speaking, is arbitrary. Packaging turns up as a quantity, for instance, when he wryly observes that a grocer would have benefited from a more regular turnover, as is indicated by the presence in his inventory of a barrel of bad figs. But not always. Grocers packaged up goods for sale, one grocer having 15 ounces of pepper that is made up in pennyworth and half pennyworth, where the quantities reference neither the package nor the contents, but the value in terms of pennies. He provides a view of contemporary sensibilities. When, for instance, legislative changes result in alterations to the manner in which the 18th century trade in tea was carried out, tea began to be advertised for sale by dealers offering to ship directly from East India Company sales in the original chests, a practice that had been previously frowned upon because it was felt that tea improved for being kept in canisters, and that the quality and uniformity of taste were improved by expert blending. He comments further, for those with expertise more in marketing than the tea trade moved in, and new techniques of advertising and selling prepackaged tea through a network of agents spread across the whole of England. Now, Stobbart's work stands out from other historians' mentions of packaging in passing. His concern to examine the grocery trade and those who ran it between 1650 and 1830 leads him to look closely at facets of both. For instance, he examines the furnishing and fittings of the shop, chest or coffer, in which stock was kept, extending by the second half of the 17th century to counters, shelves and drawers, which had become nearly as common as box and chests. And always present were the bags in which a wide variety of goods might be stored, and the small paper packets in which they were often sold. And he says, we get a glimpse of this in the small parcel of penny sugars listed in the 1752 inventory of the Kentish tallow chandler Richard Johnson, on the wrappers found in the shop of Thomas Wright, a Birmingham grocer who died in 1788, and the sundry packages listed among the shop fixtures as advertised for sale in the Bristol Mercury in 1822. And they also appear occasionally in witness statements for trials for shoplifting, but in such a way as to suggest that they were the norm. So thus we see, he goes on, 3 separate thefts of a bag containing 17 pounds of tea, it's quite a lot of tea, another with 14 pounds of ginger, and a sack with 56 pounds of rice. Also stolen, he goes on, a paper of nutmeg and a parcel of almonds. And this will be detailed in later chapters of this book I'm working on. He discusses 2 further aspects of food packaging, both of which are key to the later analysis of its social significance. First is the increasing recognisability of design and decoration of packages, their shape, the material of which they are made, and I pick branding and advertising up later in the book, and the manner in which packaging goods the grocer brought wholesale into smaller amounts for retail customers are a service central to the occupation of the grocer, effectively right until the 20th century, which I discuss later in a chapter about canisters and cans, and I can come back to that if you wish. Then there's Simone Cinotto's book, The Italian-American Table, about food and eating among Italian migrants to New York City and their descendants, and this is another in which packaging is accorded a significant place. He claims that in the interwar years, 20th century, cuisine assumed a central role in Italian-American identity. And refreshingly, he does not confine himself to the symbolic significance of food or rely on conjuring some sort of nostalgic coziness of the Italian family round the table in shaping of a diasporic Italian nation. For, and I'm quoting, the long, complex process of nation-making would not have advanced simply as a symbolic project without an abundant supply of the material stuff that fueled it. The finest imported olive oil, the best Italian cheeses, or the economic interests that promoted diasporic Italian food and a diasporic Italian identity. His is an important history, for he insists it includes attention to who is producing the foodstuffs that signified Italianness, to the tariff regimes on imports versus domestically produced items, and to the range of economic aspects of modernisation. In particular, an allegiance, he says, to an Italian cuisine based on pasta, olive oil and tomatoes, sustained both symbolically and literally in New York City, could only have developed, he claims, because of regular innovation in production, preservation and long-distance transportation, especially, he says, the canned tomato. Some of the other honourable exceptions to the claim that there is very little literature in the history of sociology of food packaging will be discussed later in the book, and if anybody's interested I can say a bit about it later on. But overall, however, it remains that there is precious little work that picks out food packaging as a focus for historical study and treats it as a topic which prompts historical or sociological questions in its own right. And if historians' attention to food packaging overall is sparse, work on specific packages can look pretty hit and miss, except, that is, recognising that focusing on one or another, for instance a tin can as Cinotto does, or arguing that the development of clear cellophane shutting off consumers' access to the product through other senses, as does Hisano when talking about the use in the 1920s or the introduction in the 1920s of cellophane for wrapping food. And that these examples represent the essential reminder that food packaging of whatever kind does not emerge, fail or persist in the social, economic or political vacuum. A historian or indeed sociologist's discussion of the development of food packaging also has to be, as we shall see now as I turn to the second section, which is very brief, a history of much else at the same time. Now I say this is very brief, I think there are 5 or 6 slides, and it's just a list. So I'm proposing that if you're going to look at the history of food packaging, you also have to look at the history of a large number of other phenomena. So you have to think about the kind of containers, and there's a list there: bags, bottles, amphorae, pottles, tin cans, and so on, and you can guess more. And this one had to go into a much smaller point size because it was too long. And you have to then do the history of the materials, whether it's leaves or stalks or seaweed, whether it's fabric, is it canvas, horn, ceramics, paper, board, card, glass, cellophane, and then of course the synthetic polymers, polythene, polystyrene, polyethylene terephthalate, etc., etc. And then it's also the history of intelligent, active and smart packaging, which has been developed in the last 2-3 decades, of machinery, their design and specialised and also specialised packaging machinery, paper bag making machines, plastic bottle making machinery, and you also have to think about the design of factories, the history of the factory design. I can't find anything on the history of factory design, but I may not be looking in the right places. And what about who designs a factory itself, its architecture, and who designs the continuous processing? Which, if anybody like me is like me and geeky about factories, you'll be watching BBC, I don't know whether it's 1 or 2, Inside the Factory series, and putting up with the tiresome presenter, because I'm just sort of gripped by how on earth these, who thought up designing a factory like that, and it's extraordinary the way it works. Oh yeah, that's a modified atmosphere packaging machine. And if anybody wants to know what modified atmosphere packaging is, or MAP for short, I can let you know later, but I haven't got time to stop now, because history of food packaging is also the history of food preservation and the various types, of which modified atmosphere packaging is one. And the one right down at the bottom, Appeal, is something which I'm not even sure is on the market yet. You modify the atmosphere of a package, and then you introduce an artificial smell of whatever the food is. So you don't let the food smell of itself, but you add a synthetic version. And then it's a history of standardization, of labeling, of the can opener, of regulation, of the idea of convenience and of convenience food, the microwave oven, of the logistics in the food supply chain and just-in-time food supply. There's a general question of the history of the industrialization of the food supply itself, never mind the globalization of it, in advertising, food acquisition, history of shopping, rise of self-service, where food packaging is absolutely central to the history, and the very idea of food retail as distinct from wholesale, and whether indeed that's being blurred. The history of transport, the history of road surfaces makes a difference. The history of containerization, as I've already mentioned, and forklift trucks. Apparently forklift trucks were introduced to this country by the Americans during the Second World War. It was invented apparently during the First World War, but the Americans brought it over here. The GIs were using them. It's also, of course, you've got to pay attention to world fairs, the emergence of something which could be called a food packaging industry, trade fairs, and the list goes on and on and on. We'll come to who that is in a second. If anybody's spotted anything that I haven't thought of and thinks I ought to add to that list, I would be very pleased, very welcome it. Now let me get rid of those pages where I printed all that out, because now I'm just going to go on to the final fairly short section, which is about what could or should a history of food packaging look like. And before embarking on this bit of the discussion, it must be stressed that my book is not to be the history of food packaging, but the beginning of work on histories of food packaging. It will be a history insofar as it will have plenty of examples, very roughly arranged from classical Rome in the early part of the book to modified atmosphere packaging towards the end. But in what other fashion could or should it be a history? And this final short section of today's talk reflects on the type of approach that could be pursued. Doing so could turn out to be a foolhardy exercise, not least because there may be no obvious ready resolution. And such reflection arises given the nature of the question placed at the centre of the project, which is, how did the modern, complex character of food packaging of modern food systems come to be as it is? And I placed it there out of genuinely, probably naive curiosity. A selection of orientations to history can be identified, noting before the start that I tend to discount a weak history. Beginning with what might be thought of as a sine qua non of history is to think in terms of chronology. And one example of this type of history is found in what could be called insider history. An outstanding example is the invaluable work by Diana Tweed, a very senior professor at the Michigan State University School of Packaging. I think it's the first such university department in the whole of the US, if not the whole world. I'm yet to follow up the history of that department. Her approach is primarily to, I should say that, you know, she does sort of technical stuff. She teaches the economics of food packaging. She teaches very technical stuff on different types of packaging, but she also turns her hand to history. So she's an insider in the food packaging world that's then writing about histories of various bits of packaging. And her approach in so doing is primarily to provide a list of events in chronological order, noting as she goes the practical functional value of the item in question. And a good example is her discussion of the utility of a wooden barrel. Barrels are probably about 2,000 years old. The Romans certainly had them, and a design that looks much like probably everybody in this room's idea of a barrel now. We could all describe what a barrel looks like. I suspect you probably couldn't describe how it's made, but you know what they look like. And she points out that a barrel is really handy because a single person, it allows a single person to move a weight and volume of goods which is too heavy to lift and too awkward to hold, for by turning a barrel on its side, it can be rolled easily enough. Once in wherever you want it, once in place, it then can easily be made stable by upending it. So getting barrels on and off a ship, for instance, is relatively simple. You know, you just need the people. You don't need any kind of rigging or any kind of pulleys or slings or other to get it onto a ship. Romans just used people and slaves to do it. So that's one kind of history, is, you know, a list of a succession of events. And then there is another, what no doubt others have already called the great man approach to history, and I probably do mean man. And a splendid case in point is the history of the origin of canning. Nicolas Appert, who managed to get himself in prison during the French Revolution, even though he was on the revolutionary side. He got himself in prison because he wasn't revolutionary enough. But he got out okay. He was a confectioner. And he's widely hailed as the father of canning. There's lots of sources which present him as such. And it is that they present him in such terms, but tend to remain silent on any precursors to anybody who is experimenting with techniques like that, and attribute the invention solely to his genius. Yes, that is something, a photograph I took relatively recently, which also shows the kind of great man of history version of the history of a tin can. And that, I'm afraid you probably can't see terribly closely, but if anybody's really interested, I can put it on at the end. You can come and have a closer look. It stands about that high. It's one of those sort of poster things, and it was at a packaging trade fair that I went to. They're free, and anybody who's interested in food package, just sign up and goes. It's absolutely brilliant. I'm ecstatic when walking around these places. All these machines and stuff to look at. And there was this history of canning. And look, there's Nicolas Appert, a little line drawing of just the photograph of the engraving that I showed you a moment ago. And there's the great man of the great man history reproduced in 2019 in this trade fair. The fact that Nicolas Appert didn't use a metal can, that's one which was made not long after Appert successfully advertised, and I can go into the story later if you want, announced the success of his principles of canning. It was made in London by Brian Donkin. He was down in Deptford, I think. and that's a photograph in the Science Museum. And incidentally, the way you opened that can was with a chisel and a hammer. The can opener wasn't invented for another 40, 50 years. So you just were sort of hacking around with chisels and hammers to get at your food. And then once somebody did come up with a can opener, the designs and the range of them, you just find them on the internet all over the place. So of course, they can now become collector's items, so it's very easy to spot them. But there's lots of designs, and if you just look at the patents, many of which are online, you've got these wonderful designs of how to open a tin can. Very interesting. Just if you're a bit geeky, you can really get caught up in it. Pardon? It's to lift it. It's simply a carrying handle, I think. I seem to remember these things are made. You make the cylinder first. You put the food in, and then you cook it in the food. So the whole thing is immersed in water, and it's a similar principle now. So the food is put in, not cooked mostly, and then it's cooked in the can. It's just the bottling principle. If anybody knows how to do home bottling, it's exactly the same principle. But then you solder on the top with solder at the end, and there's a hole there. You can probably see a sort of bulge, and that's where you had to let the steam out, and you solder that closed. And as I say, I think the loop is a carrying handle. I imagine they were quite heavy because obviously that's iron, pre-steel. But actually, for all he was called, Nicholas Appert was called the father of canning. He didn't use tin cans. He used a glass bottle. Looks like that. And the fact that he didn't actually use a can is glossed over in this great man approach to history. There's another point that I've noticed, and I really don't know what to do with, and it's noticeable, and I stupidly don't have any examples for you, that the authors of many secondary sources on histories adopt the passive voice. So, by then, preserving had developed further. So it completely conceals agency. It conceals even asking the question, well, who developed it? Who was involved in developing whatever it was? How was it done? What circumstances? How did they have the money not to be able to earn an income while they stopped and, invented things in your own private laboratory, and so on. And it's just that something I notice in passing as I'm reading, and I just don't know what to do with. But potentially, I propose there are slightly more fruitful are two approaches developed in science and technology studies. Both are no doubt long established in that field of study, developed, elaborated and critiqued, but neither appears prominent in what work there is on changes in food packaging. Both the examples I'm going to give in a minute happen to be by those who originally trained as engineers. Forgive me if you know this already, but science and technology studies is a very interesting multidisciplinary field because it attracts people who originally started off trained in one or other of the natural sciences or applied sciences, and so these two happen to be engineers. One is Henry Petrowski, and he insists that to understand the evolution of engineering feats, failures as much as successes have to be accounted for and included in the analysis. The success of a bridge design has to be understood alongside and as thoroughly alongside in as thorough an analysis of the social interactions, economic transactions, political machinations of the bridge that collapsed. In other words, don't simply look at the history of an innovation or invention by focusing only on the successful one. You have to take account of the failures as well. And there he is with his book, with this very dramatic picture on the front of the collapsing bridge. The other, which is similar, is in the work of, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, Weber Baker, B-I-J-K-E-R, Dutchman. in part at times he is writing against histories which might be too close to either insider histories, and those in any case tend to be Whiggish. So, for instance, he wants to replace approaches to the study of technical change as a rational goal-directed activity, with emphasising technical change as, and I'm quoting, a process of trial and error, as a cumulative result of small and mostly random modifications. In his highly technical history of the evolution of the bicycle, Baker seems to understand how the familiar so-called safety bicycle came to be the design adopted everywhere as the obvious one. After all, the penny farthing, for instance, was one design that was adapted and redesigned in the final decades of the 19th century. But he asks, how did it come to be superseded? And he spells out how to approach an answer by insisting that instead of only asking about the circumstances in which it was thought of as a version which did not work well, attention is also required to examining the circumstances which considered it to be one that did, an approach echoing that proposed by Petrosky. He insists too that technological invention and innovation doesn't happen by itself, but there are social groups and socio-economic and political circumstances in which people devise them, what he describes as socio-technical ensemble, to capture the character of some intimate interrelation between people and things that are involved together. For he does not forget that materiality is crucially involved. Metal gets too hot to touch when heated, no matter what the composition of social group doing the heating, to caricature the case. So we come back to that ring on the top of the can. It's a carrying handle, but you don't use it by hand. You put a rod through it to be able to lift it out of the boiling water. So, among other things to be discussed on another occasion, he argues. Baker argues for what he describes as a constructivist analysis, which stresses the malleability of technology, the possibility for choice, the basic insight that things could have been otherwise. And yet he argues such an approach also has to take into account what he calls the obduracy of socio-technical ensembles. Once established itself, a result of the combination of certain circumstances, the stoutness and durability of the socio-technical ensemble of the penny farthing, at times was hard to dislodge by a rival social group with a different design. And I think that I could probably rework the history, and I've yet to do this, of the tin can, thinking in exactly those terms. Rather ruefully, it must be admitted that it's easier to identify the types of approach to such as a chronological list of events to understanding my central question, which are least likely to be illuminating rather than the other way round. Thinking about the application of approaches from STS, Science and Technology Studies, is only just beginning. In any case, if the earlier part of this talk is on the right path, and it is indeed the case that the histories of food packaging are slender and underdeveloped, then it is perhaps unsurprising if so far examples of less fruitful approaches abound, leaving alternatives embryonic and still to be explored. Doing no more than describe a succession of events is undeniably a very useful start, and has the virtue of remaining close to the materials and the data. But its limits and does not come close to addressing the main question around which this book on food packaging revolves, which is, how did it get to be this way? And there's my final slide of a selection of reminders of what the contemporary food system looks like and the packaging involved.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. So, is there anyone that would like to ask a question? Yeah.
I don't know whether I missed it, but on the list of associated things, did you have disposal?
I didn't. Of course, it should be there, and recycling. Yeah, no, I keep rewriting this list. Of course, I mean that. Indeed, the very way in which I started thinking about food packaging was working on food waste and recycling. So I came at it from the upside down. Thank you. And I also haven't got the afterlife of food packaging either, which is very interesting.
I don't know if you're aware of the book called The Shock of the Old
Yeah.
by David Edgerton.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's
Yes, yes, that's a useful book.
yeah.
Yes, I mean sometimes those kinds of popular histories are very handy. Thank you for reminding me. Of course, it should have been in there.
I'm Tony Allen from King's College and SOAS. I'm not an economist, but I have a huge regard for political economists because we actually live in political economies, not in economies.
Sure.
So I'm not suggesting that you should get a lot of economic metrics into your work, but this type of gathering is normally wondering about power and who has power over packaging. And this question was interesting. And if you're taking a historical approach, I often, guiding graduate students, commend to them dividing the time into periods. And if you can persuade people that those periods count, you can write a pretty good thesis doing that. As it happens, you're writing this book in the middle of a huge change in the attitude to packaging and sustainability. So, have you thought? You don't want to start restructuring your book. If I was to start a book on this is where I would start, and I would get more and more interested in the later period rather than the earlier period, because very interesting things are happening as consumers push to get the people with power, in other words, the corporates, who do the designing and paying for. They're prepared to pay the full price for packaging. They're not prepared to pay the full price for the food that's in the packaging.
Sure.
So,
And that in any case, there's a question of the cost to the cost, say the environmental cost, which is not included in the monetary cost.
that's my game. So that's how I came into it.
I mean, there's actually an increasing amount of discussion of that, and writing about it. Very probably, if I was starting now, where I would start. But I started this rather a long time ago because I read another book in the middle. It's not very clever to write two books at once. It's a bit it's a bit disorienting. But so I started it and designed the architecture of the book when, if I said to somebody, they said, "What are you doing?" So I said, "Well, I'm working on a history of food packaging." They say, "What's important about food packaging?" Is the first thing they would say. Or occasionally they would say, "Oh yes, of course, branding," and then they would go off talking about Heinz and 57 varieties. But mostly it wasn't noticed. And so, of course, I've been, my work has been overtaken by events. So I shall be discussing the kinds of things that you talk about in the book, but it won't be what I'm also as interested in is, and I haven't talked about today, is something I'm starting to call transitions. And that may be not at all a good way of.
Commonly used.
Well, yes, but I mean, I'm not a proper historian, so I'm sure historians have used it. But what I'm talking about and what I'm interested in is the way that, and this is partly where I come from, the way that particularly sociologists, but also to some extent historians, overlook the materiality of what we're dealing with when it comes to food and when it comes to packaging. Sociologists are really bad at dealing with that. Anthropologists are much better.
And historians are very good at it.
Yeah, no.
Yeah,
I mean, and I only say to some extent historians.
No, I'm just thinking that design history might be quite a useful way of kind of looking at this in terms of the materiality and the which you're doing and the material cultures around it.
Well, I have to be careful because, I mean, design history in packaging is actually, really big compared to what I'm also trying to cover, and I'm rather rudely confining it to my final chapter. I happen not to be very interested.
I'm not talking about the look of something. I'm talking about what decisions that are made and the process by which the packaging is made. So, I mean, I'm a design historian. And a lot of what you're talking about is the things that I would be looking at if I was
Well,
researching.
I
So
maybe
it's obviously,
I maybe need to sort of put a hand up and ask to come and talk to you sometime. I'd be glad of your help,
it looks
please.
like I'm not the
I
only
would
one.
say in food history as well, the material turn is pretty
Pardon?
well. Like I work a lot in the dairy industry,
Yeah.
and I'd say the material turn is pretty well established in that. But there's also quite a lot of stuff that I think on the materiality of like food decisions and stuff like that. So I don't know. I feel like historians are playing catch up slightly to archaeologists, but I feel like looking at the materiality of food now, that's like pretty common.
I think I'm thinking about a lot of the American food study stuff where you wouldn't notice that the food was a substance, or that people were a substance. So it may be that I'm both generalising and ignorant, and need to read more widely. But certainly I am interested in making sure that materiality is included in this discussion.
I think if you're talking about the materials and the tactility of things, and also the way in which they affect the food, sometimes positively, sometimes not. To me, that's design history. Another thing that occurred to me, which I've just forgotten. Sorry. Yes. Sorry.
It'll come back, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And if not, I'll come and talk to you and prompt it to come back.
There's a really good edited collection called Food and Material Culture that does like a lot of stuff in this, and it's got a very interesting chapter about upper as well.
Food and material culture now.
Yeah.
How have I not come across that?
I came across it quite late as well.
Did you remember who edited it?
No.
Doesn't matter.
No.
I shall find it. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your talk. I just wanted to follow on about the question about packaging today, and looking at some of the materials that you talked about, like seaweed and written a few down, board, wood, and barrels, and whether you think any of those might see more of a revival, particularly with a focus on, plastic waste and packaging waste.
That's very interesting. I mean, it seems that they're now in the sort of quasi-industrial activist literature. That field where the industry is defending itself and the activists and consumers are jumping up and down. Is now known as the Attenborough effect. So November 2017, I think it was, that final episode of The Blue Planet, which drew attention to the single-use plastic in particular. And that what seems to be substantiated is that a lot of people are reverting from buying milk in plastic bottles from a supermarket to glass bottles delivered to the doorstep by the old milkman who did the rounds in those electric, or in my day, I'm old enough to remember horse and cart. And then that's prompted quite a lively discussion in that industry activist arena, where the plastics industry is coming back and pointing out that glass is heavy and so transport costs are higher, CO2 emissions get higher, and that although it can be reused, bottles can be reused as distinct from recycling the glass. That uses a huge amount of water. So there's this sort of that's I think where the discussion has got to, and I have yet to be able to track what the science each side is basing its arguments on. But I have no idea whether it will happen with wood or other materials, except that, I suspect everybody here has noticed that there's a lot more plastic packaging which is actually biodegradable and made from potato starch. And I can remember I went to Helsinki to a big technical institute and talked to people in the lab there. And one woman had made a plastic out of potato skins, which repels grease, but unfortunately, she said to me rather plaintively, it dissolves in water. But she was trying to sell it to McDonald's because, you know, if you have a sort of a cornet, you know, that sort of cornet shape thing of chips, you could then put her potato peel plastic, and that would absorb the grease, and so you wouldn't get such greasy fingers, and McDonald's weren't very interested. But I think that there's also increasing amounts of turning to plant-based substances for all kinds of packaging, and a return to using wood pulp or experimenting with that. So I think the industry is ahead of your question and ahead of my knowing much about it.
Well, that's interesting. Me and Laura, we work from a market research side on packaging.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, and we're working with companies like Nestle who are, of course, thinking about how to remove. I think they're thinking more of it as a marketing side. So everyone is talking plastic, and I think what consumers often forget is that plastic has a purpose now. The way that we build our food system is that, you know, plastic keeps food safe, it keeps it fresh, and so they're kind of, these companies are in this sort of conundrum, like you mentioned, where they have to get rid of it because consumers won't buy it otherwise. But at the same time, the products have to also taste and look exactly the same.
Exactly.
So we get a lot of questions around, well, you know, what's the next thing? Is it packaging water and using seaweed as a bottle that you can just ingest, so there's zero waste? Or is it about, you know, I think we've seen a lot more.
Think also about the government, as you said before, so the macroeconomics level. We think the tax of recyclable material in China is 1.2%. It's nothing. So you can create, you think it's recyclable, but if outside you don't have any infrastructure to make the cycle a loop, it's impossible. In Japan, 72% is incinerated. In Europe, we are below 50%. For deposit, for when we talk about biodegradable, compostable, I mean, there's a much big difference between biodegradable and compostable, what is industrial, what is at home. And when it's industrial, the consumer don't understand what they think, oh my God, it's not compostable, they don't believe in that. Or the biomaterial is so important, the European legislation is very important that in Italy, the RPET, the recyclable plastic, in natural mineral water could be maximum 50%. In UK it's 100. There is no legislation common in Europe. It's very important to understand also the legislation and the infrastructure and the government, because these would be the biggest limits of the packaging solution. So the company can really move and think solution, but after we need to think the consumer, how they see all the solutions they are not really bringing to a result. Because if my compostable coffee pot is not compostable in my garden, I don't believe anymore why I need to pay a higher price for that. So it's very important to think also the consumer perception.
Of course.
Of the material.
Yeah, exactly.
And the cultural material. So it's true, the glass is heavy, but it's really perceived as premium. So it's growing, it's healthy. Carbonates is going up. So it's important to understand all the cultural material, the design, how it's moved, and how it's appealing with the new lifestyle. So what I think from the research side, maybe the consumer is important to understand the packaging, because what it changed more than other things is the consumer behavior.
I mean, there's a very interesting instance with catch up on the radio. I was able to transcribe it verbatim. Was a discussion on of modified atmosphere packaging, where they had a cook and food writer talking about how important it was to eat fresh food and to prepare it yourself in the kitchen and to always use it organic. I was talking about fresh salads, and somebody else was talking about, I think they had a question on the phone in, and somebody was asking, what about bagged salads? And the food writer was very dismissive of bagged salads. And I think it was the presenter who said something like, of course, those bag salads very often had a modified atmosphere, and the food writer obviously hadn't heard of that, and said, "Oh, I wouldn't want gas in my salad." And that's an example of either the consumer or a lay non-professional perspective and not understanding that a modified atmosphere package contains the gases that we're breathing all the time, except in slightly different proportions. And of course, if you then take the word gas into a sort of everyday context, then suddenly gas has terrible, really negative connotation. So that's another example of the disjunction between either the lay or the consumer or the everyday understanding of terms and explanations, and then the sort of technical one, which of course is what the industry is always grappling with. Yeah, of course. But I hope that both of you will be able to stay a bit, because I want to grab you and make sure I can make contact, please. And you too, please.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
No. I was just apologising. It sounded terribly rude, but I do want to talk to you, if I may.
I've got a question from Kelly Spring online.
Oh, right.
Who's one of our conveners who's in the US.
Hello, Kerry.
So it's very much going back to the history of food packaging as well. But I wonder if Anne would comment on the impact of war in general and the Second World War in particular. So war in general, as in food packaging, obviously, on change and innovation in food packaging.
I don't know. This is one of the. I mean, there are times, I think I mentioned it to you earlier, when I think, well, there's a very good reason why there isn't a history of food packaging, a book-length treatment, because it's impossible to fit into one book, and it keeps falling apart, and I keep chasing off after something which could turn into another book. So I actually don't know. I've tried to make sure that I keep away from it. On the other hand, you can look at sort of wartime shortages of paper. And certainly, newspaper had to be pressed into all kinds of service, which in peacetime it wouldn't have been used. But I actually don't know, so please tell Kelly that I shall think about it. Thank you for her question.
Definitely. I suppose actually leading out of that in a way is sort of, how is food? Is there a sort of particular difference in how food is packaged in more extreme situations, like sort of for military use when they're sort of on the march, or astronauts is something I was thinking of,
exactly.
Sort of going in space, obviously needs something very different.
Indeed, and I mean, you can go to the Aerospace Museum in Washington, and you can actually buy for your kids. You can buy an example of a little pouch of astronauts' food, dried stuff, and then of course, I mean, one of the impetuses to the invention of the tin can is Napoleon needing to supply his this was before he was emperor, when he was head of the army, needing to feed the army. You either, as we know, you either live off the land as an army, or you take your supplies with you. And he had, an increasingly long campaigns. He needed taking supplies with him that lasted, and so he was instrumental in offering a reward or a prize of 12,000 francs for somebody who could come up with a solution to his food preservation problem. So there's an example indeed of wars being pretty significant.
In that sense, or making it more common at least. Okay, thanks. Anyone? Yes.
I think just on the same side of that, or on the opposite side of that coin, it might be interesting to look at international food aid and the distribution of surplus food around the world.
What does it go in?
Right. Yeah.
The chances are it doesn't go in things which are not very well decorated. Right. They've just got UN aid or whatever it might be stamped on the side. I think we've probably all seen pictures of it.
Yeah. But I'm sure there are lucrative contracts behind all that packaging.
I'm sure there are.
I wonder whether it might be interesting to look at when packaging is missing or when it's absent. Like, I know we used to all when I was little, all the oranges were like wrapped in these individual white wrappers, but those seem to have disappeared for some reason.
What, those bits of paper?
Yeah.
They're beautiful, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Or like we used to, package fruit or vegetables all individually, and now we do less of that. Like, I wonder whether there's something there. Also, as far as I understand about packaging, there are 3 kinds in any one project. In any one product, you have like the inner, the intermediate, or the outer, or something. Like a bar of soap, the inner packaging would already be just the fact that we shape it as a block without any of the papers. So whether there's something there in terms of packaging, like we used to make in the 17th, 18th centuries, we cut our sugar in these loaves without any other packaging. That was our packaging, cutting it in a sort of consumable way. I wonder whether there's something there.
That's very important, is to look at things not just that survive or develop, but also disappear. I mean, one thing that's disappeared is thinking of sugar is the blue paper, which was used from sort of 18th century onwards, right into 50s. I can remember, a pound of sugar or 2 pounds bag of sugar was that very distinctive blue paper. And I've yet to check with somebody who's a paper, knows about paper, what kind of paper it was. But it was a deep and very distinctive blue. But that's disappeared.
My question is about modernity, because I think your central question is like, how do we get to the modern complex kind of packaging we've got now? And lots of the examples of literature you throw up, the things that you often have problems with, like the great man kind of view of it is these are modern kind of developments, all to do with the kind of quickening of economic processes and capitalism, rise of capitalism and 19th century urbanization and all these big processes. So having kind of gone into the broad history of it, has that affected the way has that influenced the way you've been able to critique that kind of modern association? We think, is packaging something that's modern, or should we kind of complicate that kind of much more broadly?
I'm afraid I'm always up for complicating things.
Yeah.
Are you? I'm not sure if I quite followed you. Are you saying that that somehow that has led to that kind of approach, that kind of thinking, the fact that it's a contemporary food system is so complex?
I think so. I can also see lots of aspects of modernity reflected in the way food's packaged. For example, or even postmodern in lots of ways. The way that things are disguised and then hidden, or turned in, or commoditized very, very obviously, and put behind glossy paper and created an object and turned into an object of desire. Or the fact that packaging allows you to transport things very quickly and over greater distances, which are aiding all these kind of processes of development. And they feel very much connected to the process of kind of quickening commercialization that we typically associate with the industrialized world. But actually, you're looking at packaging back to the classical period and various stages in between. I'm just interested whether our very modern view that we're talking about packaging now, which feels like a very modern thing, do we need to kind of break those two things apart?
I think we probably do need to break them apart. I was trying to think. I mean, the very fact that we can talk about the rise of a packaging industry and that could become nameable is a feature of this modern system. I suppose while you were talking, I was trying to think myself back, to the impossible thing, sort of thinking, if I was my great-great-grandmother and she had my grandmother in 1880, food packaging wouldn't be a sort of expression that would come to mind. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? And that our thinking about it is also a product of the current state we've achieved, or achieved is reached.
You're about to say something, Dan.
Well, yeah. I'm just going to say that, that you could say there has always been a packaging industry, because coopers and barrels.
Yeah.
So there were dedicated manufacturers making things specifically to transport food. But one thing that I think needs to be part of this is notions of hygiene
Mm-hmm.
and cleanliness,
Mm-hmm.
because I think a lot of the, for example, water bottles, that's predicated on a notion that tap water isn't safe. Because I can remember going to Europe in the 80s and you didn't drink the tap water, you bought bottled water. So, you know, it's turned in, maybe turned into something else now, but I think that's one of the elements of and making things look clean.
Sure. I mean, the question of the visibility of the packaging is something that recurs. So that one of the things that Heinz did, which was very cunning, that when he started getting tomatoes from his the family garden and using his mother's recipe to make ketchup, he had the brainwave to put it in clear glass to show that his customers it could be trusted, and that there was at the time considerable suspicion of things that were, you know, because ketchups and sauces like that were starting to be commercialised in the period, which is sort of 1870, 1880, 1890. And they were mistrusted apparently because you couldn't be sure what was in it. I think it's Robert Roberts in the classic Slum has an example of a bottle of dandelion and burdock, which was a ceramic bottle, not a glass bottle, which had a dead mouse in it and caused, you know, the predictable kind of horror. So being able to identify what you're being sold is at issue. Being able to be able to be confident that it's safe is at issue. They won't poison you. So that the hygiene thing is related to, you know, being safe to eat, as distinct from, you know, that's a sort of an elaboration of your point about hygiene.
Well, there's also something about things that have been handled. I'm thinking of cucumbers. That can only be because people don't want to think of other people having handled that cucumber. You know, the shrink wrapped thing. So, you know, there's no, it's packaging, but there's no obvious and practical purpose for that. Why would you shrink wrap it?
Well, the industry will tell you it will last 14 days and will challenge you to buy a shrink wrapped one and a non-shrink wrapped one and see
Really,
which one lasts.
Is that the reason?
Pardon?
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
No, I'm saying that, yeah, it lasts longer
Yeah.
apparently, and it doesn't waste much more. So. If it was for like a such a thing, like anything that you would eat with skin would need to be shrink wrapped.
Yeah.
Specifically the side is shrink wrapped because apparently they're not
Right.
Also, in terms of transportation, if you think that you've got tons of cucumbers, if you have one bad one and it's connected quite a long way, then it's going to contaminate the product.
Ignore that one.
I think it's a dual purpose, right? So that's comparison, and there's also this idea of like literal purity and figurative purity that really kind of comes into play with food packaging, especially with shrink wrap.
Well, I mean, I think the issue of trust is also incredibly important, and you know, at least there's a book I read in high school called Jungle by Upton Sinclair.
Yes.
And you know, I think it's worth examining, you know, whether the reasons we trust food that we can't see when it comes to us in a package like a can, we're also implicitly putting trust in government regulation, like FDA, agencies that monitor that kind of thing, and then the implication, you know, so who are we? There's lots of different structures of trust that lead us to feel safe taking a can off the shelf and eating what's in it, you know, without seeing it before we, maybe ever.
that comes back to the point about the relationship between somebody who's buying food from somebody else. So the point that Stobart keeps making is that the 18th, 19th century grocer was the person who provided a service for his customers and her customers, and sought to develop a relationship of trust, and sought to be trusted enough to be able to recommend that you buy this thing rather than that thing, and that they were the expert in the commodities for sale, and that the argument is that once you get food packaging developing, and that enables Clarence Saunders, God, my memory's going, I think that's right, who invented self-service in the 1920s with his Piggly Wiggly, and he's actually patented the design of the self-service shop. Is that then alters the relationship of trust with the grocer, because then the relationship is shifted, if you can actually help yourself, is shifted from trust in the grocer to trust to be conjured by the manufacturer, and so that the packaging is implicated in that shift. So indeed, trust is something that runs through.
What's interesting